Okay, this video is a small continuation from the previous one. If you remember, in the previous one we used this default operator so that if style wasn't passed, we defined what it would be using this OR. Now, it so happened that in here, look, what I'm doing is I'm adding an event listener on mouse over. So inside this function here, this, if you remember, I say if you remember because you're following a course on JavaScript and this has been covered before, that this is the element that we're mousing over. So if we've already got the element we're mousing over, then it seems a bit weird to pull out the ID of the element that we've got, to pass it to change style, so that inside change style it can use that ID to get a reference to the element. It seems a bit of a waste that we've already got a reference to the element. So what about, instead of passing in the ID, I just passed in this instead? Now, at first things will break, so let's just be prepared for that. So I'll reload this page. I'll put a breakpoint on that line where things are going to cause things to break. Mouse over the top of it. It'll call change style, passing in this. In other words, the entire element, not this ID, which is what it was passing in before. So let's watch it go into there. It gets ID, except now ID isn't a string. It's not the ID, it's actually an object. So let's actually just play around and figure out how we could find that out. What was it? I said ID. An ID, look, is an element. So how could we figure out what that is? How about if I say ID, and there's an operator called instance of, what? I wonder what it would be an instance of. Well, it would be an object, I think. It's true. So ID is an instance of object. So in other words, what I'm trying to get at is that if this thing here is an instance of object, we don't need to bother doing that because we've already got it. Does that make sense? So let's put that into place. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that my variable element, we're going to have some sort of test that if that ID is an instance of object, then what I'm going to use is just simply the ID. Otherwise, I'm going to go document get element by ID and whatever that ID was. Okay, so here I'm using what's known as a ternary if operator. The ternary if operator, if you've not come across it before, follows a simple form. It's a test, and the question mark is like then. So if that test is true, then it will do that. And the colon is like else, so else it will do that. So if that test is true, then that will be, and I've missed out the equal sign, then if that test is true, then that will be assigned to element, and if that test is false, then that will be assigned to element. So let me save that, reload this page. I'll just let this run, it'll give me an error. Reload the page. I'll put a breakpoint there so we can see it. I'll mouse over the top of it. So now it's passing in an object. So let's go into there. So is ID an instance of object? Well, yes it is. So it will immediately store that into element. So element just equals the things we passed in, and the rest of the code will work. Now when I come to mouse out, ID isn't an instance of object. Look, we can see it's just a string, b1. So it won't do that, it will do else instead. So in other words, it will get the element with that ID, and element, at the moment undefined, will then equal the same element, and the code still works. So in other words, what I've done is make this more flexible, so we can pass in an ID, or we can pass in an actual object. So there we go. We've written a function, we've put it in a separate file, we've linked to it using that script source equals. So that means that we can now loop through those elements, attaching an on mouse enter event and attaching an on mouse leave event listener, a function, which we'll call change style, which we can either pass in the object in question, or we can pass in the object's ID, we can pass in a class that it will change to, or if we don't pass in a class, it will automatically use the class called highlight.